My great-grandmother was the youngest in her family. She came directly from Sweden. She had two older brothers, Olaf and Oki, who came over from Sweden first and got established, and they sent for her. Her name was Olvi, O-L-V-I. She was my great-great-grandmother, and I miss her to this day. She was just wonderful. The only time I ever heard her get upset was when, let's see, when we were driving in the car and her brother Oki was with her, and he would say something about us being lost or something like that, and the worst that she ever said was, "Oh, fiddlesticks." And every Christmas, actually starting at the beginning of November, Granny would make cookies for anyone and everyone. She would distribute them in shoeboxes and in coffee cans each year to each of the adults in the family that would come home for Christmas. And sometimes there was a lot of people. That was my aunts and my uncles and my cousins and my nephews and nieces. Well, I didn't have nephews and nieces then, but anyone who came home for Christmas, they knew they were going to get a container full of cookies, and were big. These were big coffee cans. These were large coffee cans. But if you didn't return your shoebox or your coffee can to her, then you weren't going to get cookies for the next year. She ran her kitchen with just herself inside, and every holiday we had at her house, it was just her. Mostly it was Christmas Eve at her house, and she lived in a home in southern Ferndale that used to be what they considered out in the country. And all of the interior of the home, the woodwork was all done by my great-grandfather, which we called Poppy. I'm told that she kept chickens for food and for eggs, and that it was Depression era. In the Depression era, she would have my grandmother put down newspaper on the floor to keep the floors clean. Sometimes we'd spend the night at my grandmother's house and my great-grandmother's house, and we would sleep on the floor in the living room, and her house was so quiet, and you could see the light of the moon coming through the windows, and she lived right down the street from some trains, so every now and then the trains would go by and you'd hear train whistles. And in the morning, my brother and I would eat honeycombs and drink orange juice. I think it was Tropicana orange juice, out of these very small dark green glasses that had like ripples in the sides of them. They were juice glasses, and you eat the honeycombs, cut up your mouth, and then drink the orange juice, and it stings. But those were some memories I have of my great-grandmother. When we would go to her house, she always had a cookie jar, and it always had cookies inside. And there were some big cookies too. They weren't real small cookies. They were pretty large, and they were always homemade. She gardened a lot. I don't know if she liked to garden or if she did it out of necessity. But in the spring, she would either rototill it or turn it over by hand herself, or she would have somebody come and do that for her. Usually my dad would do that for her. And throughout the year, she would go and bury coffee grounds, and she would bury eggshells in the garden as natural compost. So then when the rototill went through, it incorporated it all into the soil. She used to grow rhubarb and make rhubarb pies. And I can't remember what other kinds of vegetables she used to grow or fruits. She loved to put together puzzles. That was the other thing. When we would go visiting, she'd almost always have a card table set up with puzzles, jigsaw puzzles that she put together. And they were hard jigsaw puzzles. And she didn't want any, if we got her puzzles for a gift, she didn't want the easy ones. She wanted the tough ones. So she could do those. She also worked on the crossword puzzles. Her hearing was going away, but her brother's eyesight wasn't so great, but his hearing was really sharp. So they lived together in that house for a long time, and between the two of them, they could hear or see anything. They liked to go driving in sunny days. They'd like to go out when Granny was driving. Granny walked with a limp. I was told that when she was very young, she had polio, and the doctors told her mom, my great-great-grandmother, that she would never walk again. And her mother said, oh, yes, she will. And she made her walk. And so she was not confined to a wheelchair because of polio. And she could get around with a cane. So she used the cane to get around. She always wore, I think they were like black or dark brown, like shoes, and always nylons. And I don't think I ever saw Granny in pants. Almost always she was wearing dresses. And she also had aprons that she'd put over the dresses. And I learned later that aprons were for keeping your clothes from getting dirty so that you didn't have to continue to wash them or get them replaced, especially back in the Depression era. She saved everything. She saved rubber bands and bags and paper clips and snippets of yarn and twine. She saved all kinds of things. She lived to be, I think she was 92, maybe 95. And she lived in that same house for a long, long, long time. Then when she couldn't take care of that house herself, because she was very, very, very Swedish, very stubborn. And when she couldn't take care of that house herself, she and Oki moved to a senior citizen apartment complex, and there she made cookies for everybody and was part of the activities inside the nursing home. And I think Oki got sick first and passed away, and then Granny started getting confused and needed to go into a long-term care place. And sometimes when we visited her, she knew who we were, and other times she didn't. And close to the end, she didn't. She did live long enough to hold her first great-grandchild. That would be my daughter, Jennifer. And luckily, we've got a picture of the 5 generations. So there was Granny and Grandma and Mom and me and little Jennifer. And those are the memories I have about my great-grandmother, Olvi Bonn.